everybody. And just to say thank you on behalf of the Scottish speakers for the opportunity to participate in the EHTEL Autumn Webinar Series. My name is Nessa. I work with the Scottish Government's Digital Health and Care Directorate, but our team also work very widely with the NHS, the health services in Scotland, and also with industry and with third sector organisations, really right across the public sector. So I'm delighted that we have two Scottish speakers who I will just briefly introduce. First, you're going to hear from Barbara Mills. Barbara is Deputy Programme Director at CivTech in Scotland, and she will explain what CivTech is and what they do, and how they take a broader public sector approach to innovation, how they use innovation challenges, and really the work that they're taking forward right now, and as Mark said, the work coming up. And then we will pause once we've heard from Barbara, and then we will hear from Professor David Lowe. As well as being a clinician, David is the Clinical Director with the Scottish Health Innovation Partnership and works very closely in that role with Scottish Government, but also with test beds and innovation partners across Scotland. So we're going to try this morning to give you some insight from quite a broad perspective initially around public sector innovation, and then bring in very specific, more specific examples of innovation in healthcare.
Delighted to be here with the chance to tell you a little bit about CivTech and the wider innovation sort of landscape in Scotland before David today. As Nessa has already said, I'm Barbara Mills. I am the Deputy Programme Director at CivTech. CivTech is a Scottish Government programme. We sit within the Digital Directorate of the Scottish Government. Before I jump into a bit more about exactly what our work is, I thought it might be worth highlighting what the approach of the Scottish Government overall is when we're looking at procuring innovation into the public sector generally. We have an approach which encourages both what we describe as push innovation and pull innovation. So push innovation being where we've got suppliers who have got either existing products or high technology readiness level emerging products that they have opportunities to share with the public sector in Scotland through a portal that we've set up called Scotland Innovates. That is intended to be able to get some of those great products that people have already developed, great products and services that people have already developed into the public sector more quickly, and has a process for assessment of those. That, however, is not the approach that CivTech takes. CivTech is focused on the other side of the innovation equation, on the pull side of innovation. And if we can move on to the next slide, I'll describe a little bit about how we approach that. So what we're effectively trying to do with CivTech is tackle two problems, I guess, but the first one is when it comes to the public sector, whenever we look to engage with innovative products or services, we need to be mindful of procurement approaches. And the traditional approach to procurement requires that people write specifications. But how do you write a specification for a product that doesn't exist yet? How do you procure something that you might not know exists yet? Now, this is this pull side of innovation, which is approached in various different organisations across Scotland and across the wider UK, and I'm sure, and wider Europe in different ways, obviously with the open challenge-based format. But there's two sides to what our approach is based on. I mentioned we're trying to address that. How do you procure something that maybe doesn't exist yet? But how do you also do that in a way which means that you're genuinely engaging with the parts of the market, the types of suppliers that are going to be genuinely producing the most innovative products? And often we see that not necessarily in the large scale systems integrators that we might be used to working with in the public sector. We can see that in startups and SMEs that do business with the public sector. So our system has been set up to try and address both sides of that. If we can move on to the next slide, I'll give you a run through of exactly how we approach this. So our approach to how do you procure something that might not exist yet, in the first instance, we don't start with the solution that we think we need. We start by focusing on the problems that we need to solve. So we work in the first instance with public sector organizations across to look at what are those problems that you can't currently solve with the types of solutions that might exist in the market at the moment. And we work with them to define them as challenges. Apologies, I think I might have some connectivity issues, so please do let me know if they start to interfere. We define them as challenges, and we publish those challenges as effectively problem statements that we're looking for the ideas from the market as to how to solve. We do not solutionize at this stage. We focus on what is the problem that needs to be solved, what is the context of that problem in terms of what key barriers might be faced in implementing a solution, and we heavily focus, instead of on technology, on the outcomes we want to achieve. When we've published our challenges and invited those solutions in, we're not just inviting solutions from maybe the types of business that might usually interact with the public sector. The CivTech process is open to anybody, including individuals who might have the right skills and experience to take an idea from an idea through to a fully developed product. And we then have a set of steps that we follow to be able to develop those ideas into solutions that can be implemented. And I'll go through those now. The first step after initial sifting is an exploration stage. Very brief, only 3 weeks long, but it's an opportunity for the suppliers to get to know the problem better and the challenge sponsor team, as we call it, the organization that they would be working with. And it's a chance for them to iterate on the first idea they submitted. So we often see significant change happen at this point between the desktop exercise of people's ideas of what they think the solution is, through to when they've done a bit more learning about the problem, had an opportunity maybe to do some user research, etc. They come back with an iterated idea. They pitch that again to our panel for a place on our accelerator. And this is where we think that the CivTech program is relatively unique. The CivTech Accelerator is intended to provide an opportunity for those successful companies to take those ideas and develop minimum viable products, MVPs, something that's not going to necessarily be commercially deployable, but something that can be tested. But it's not just about sending the supplier off to go and do the work. It's a collaborative stage where the challenge sponsor, the organization who has set the challenge, work together with the company to iterate and build in what we've described as an agile way. And at the end of it, if they have got that successful MVP, there is an opportunity for them to get a much bigger pre-commercial agreement to take that MVP from a prototype, a testable prototype, all the way through to a product that can be implemented. We have a demo day, which is an important part of our of the engagement with wider stakeholders and opportunities for that business that has submitted that idea to not only engage with the organisation they're developing the solution for, but to explore their market opportunities to sell this product elsewhere, because that's a critical part of what we're doing. We're not just solving the challenge, we're trying to provide commercial opportunities for those businesses. And then the pre-commercial stage takes those products to a point where they're ready to be commercially implemented, but also where those products then can go on to it. The companies that have developed those products can then go on to sell the product to their second, third customer, whether that's the rest of Scotland, the rest of UK, rest of Europe, the rest of the world. If we could move on to the next slide, please. So just to highlight some of the successes we've had in this area, we've actually done more than we've just closed our 9th round, meaning that we've now actually done 94 challenges. 90% of the businesses we're engaging with are either early stage startups or SMEs. We do have some larger PLCs and larger companies engaging, but we're showing that the model works for those organizations that maybe typically wouldn't be doing business with the public sector. We're creating jobs, 327 so at the time this was counted, and we're also finding that we're able to leverage the power of the public purse into providing opportunities for those companies to get investment elsewhere. So far we've seen over 67 million go into the businesses that have gone through the CivTech process. If we could move on to the next slide, I'll just briefly highlight the challenge that we have worked with David on at the Office of the Chief Scientist at the Scottish Government, because as I've mentioned, this approach is an approach that we use across the Scottish Government public sector organisations, but we also do work specifically with health colleagues. And there are some nuances to how we apply this in a health context, and I'd be happy to discuss that a little bit more, perhaps in the questions if it comes up. But our latest challenge has been one of the best responded to challenges that we've ever had in CivTech. We set a challenge that actually came from a piece of work that the Chief Scientist's office had done around a call for effectively problem statements from clinicians across Scotland. And it was really great to be able to work with them on the Chief Scientist's office from a strategic point of view on effectively a prioritised list of challenge areas that the Chief Scientist office had identified. We identified that the menopause challenge, which had been submitted, was a really great example of one which worked really well with our model in terms of the opportunities that there are to engage with digital focused startups, SMEs, and to be able to use the structured system that we have that supports not only the businesses, but also the organisations from a public sector point of view to go through each step of that process. We worked with the challenge statement that had been developed for the Chief Scientist's office and broke that down into a multi-part challenge, which is effectively trying to seek solutions to problems in women being able to identify information and self-help and signposting, which is a key part of looking at how we manage pressure on our primary and secondary care services, but also how we are able to maybe take advantage of opportunities and new technologies around things like symptom tracking, but specifically symptom tracking to support conversations with clinicians. We're also have a challenge here in the space between the referral process between primary and secondary care and the issues associated with the management of patients that have been referred through to secondary care. And critically for this area, what we identified was that the impact of these symptoms on women in the workplace is maybe most significant. At least in terms of a lot of the research, they highlight that that's one of the areas where they find it hardest to manage symptoms. So we've included that scope within the scope of the challenge. And what I'm really pleased to say is, across all the applications that we had responding, we've got really solid responses that cover the various different aspects of this challenge that we've set. We're just at the point where we're sifting at the moment, so we don't have any outcomes at this point to be able to talk to you about, but it's a really great example of us being able to take that process, which is generic to the wider Scottish public sector and has been applied very effectively, and focus it in on particular areas of health where our processes particularly complements the requirements that sit within that digital health and telecare type of space. And we hope to build from this in the future to look at a wider space around how we could deliver another range of challenges, a mission-focused basis for challenges in the future. That's my slides. I'm happy to pause here, and that's the details for our website and contact details if anyone's interested.
Thank you, Barbara. Thank you very much. Really good insight into how CivTech works as part of the innovation landscape in Scotland.
I've got a couple of practical questions that are about how CivTech operates, Barbara. One is, who or what types of people are the challenge sponsors? Can you give a bit of clarification about types of people there? And then the second question is, what types of channels, what kinds of channels are you using to invite or to attract the initial suggested solutions, the initial suggested approaches? And I think that's probably all about we've got time for, and we'll come back at the end of the hour.
Thank you, Diane. And yes, so with the types of organisations that set challenges have been everything from we've worked with Scottish Government Health and Social Care colleagues on a range of different areas, NHS, NSS, working currently with Chief Scientist's Office, but we've also worked with Forestry and Land Scotland, who are responsible for the Scottish forestry estate on solutions associated with growing more trees and protecting from invasive species. We have worked across a really broad range, so childcare focused solutions. We also work with the third sector, and we actually find that collaborative challenges where you have a sponsored team that is made up of multiple organizations to be really, really valuable. Because one of the hardest things for suppliers that are trying to engage on developing innovative products can be about getting that engagement across the different areas that need to engage. So having an innovation flow structure that enables multi-stakeholder client-side approach is really helpful. There's also something that I would say about personas. I think maybe we don't have time to go into it just now, but I think as interesting is the change in the types of people that we have engaging through the program. We have a kind of a very specific approach to looking at personas because it helps us understand what our challenge sponsors need. In terms of channels for respondents, this is where the CivTech team ourselves will do a reasonable amount of work with the challenge sponsor to identify what are the right audiences to engage with. Now, we've already got links into a lot of groups that organizations wouldn't typically. So tech meetup type of networks and the kind of technology community type of groups that we engage with on a regular basis. But we also do find ourselves sometimes doing more specialist engagement activities. Over the summer, we were at field sports and game fairs. We were doing 2 challenges that related to deer management. So we were targeting some of our communications at suppliers that were more likely in that space. It takes some work to identify where your audience is likely to sit, but that's part of we effectively handhold at each stage of the process with our public sector organisations. So Emma, my colleague on the call, leads a lot of that work and does it very effectively.
Thanks you very much, Nessa. I presume you can see my slides. So firstly, thank you to Mark and Diane for the opportunity to speak today, and had a long relationship with EHTEL through Donna, working through a number of the Horizon challenges and other activity. So Barbara's kind of outlined one of our approaches to ultimately pre-procurement of innovation into health. And what I'm going to do is really talk about some of the other enabling infrastructure. And as I was thinking about this presentation, while I'm going to touch on some of the technical aspects of the infrastructure availability, I think it's pertinent to this call that it's really about how do we build capability capacity, and actually it's how do we establish collaborations and relationships as part of that enabling infrastructure. And that's a lot of what we're doing in the Chief Scientist, is investing in that element as well as the kind of on-prem tin resource of compute. There's a little disclaimer that I am a clinician working in the emergency department in the Queen Elizabeth in Glasgow. It's one of the largest health boards in Europe. My academic interest is predominantly around about AI and clinical decision support, but some of the context of what I'm going to speak to, and unashamedly the examples I'm going to use are ones that I'm a chief investigator in, because at least I have a deep understanding of those, recognise there's many other opportunities out with that realm of multimorbidity and AI. What I am not ever going to talk to is AI infrastructure, and I think that takes a whole other talk, which I'm not going to do today. I think everybody in this call understands very much the challenges that we face, which are rapidly ageing, comorbid population with increasing demand on the healthcare system to be able to respond to those needs. I'm going to be on call tonight in the Queen Elizabeth Emergency Department, and I'm going to feel that very much in my face. And that's really around about ambulances waiting outside, exit block out into the rest of the hospital, but ultimately that reflects a system that's challenged, and the opportunity for the people in this call is to really think about transformation, and that's about technology and digital health, but how does that fit into a pathway? And that's very much, I suppose, the approach we've taken, and really what Barbara's already outlined is that piece around about innovation, is how do we describe the challenge, how do we understand the pathway, and then look for opportunities for solutions, and be able to, as Barbara's already said, be able to pull those through, be able to define our challenge with a degree of granularity. It doesn't just say there's loads of ambulances outside, or we need to look after an increasingly frail population, but how can we define that challenge that allows industry and academia to be able to respond? And the focus that predominantly the work that I'm going to talk around is around about COPD, so chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, and heart failure. And they account for a disproportionate share in Scotland and in Europe and worldwide for healthcare resources. And the typical numbers are 5% of the budget of healthcare, certainly in Scotland, goes towards COPD, and another 5% against heart failure. But those challenges are perpetuated through, so for instance, for heart failure, 80% of those individuals get their diagnosis during an index hospitalisation. How can we push that into the community to be able to do case finding, to be able to identify those individuals with heart failure, put them through a diagnostic process, recognising again treatment initiation reduces hospitalisation within 6 weeks, and how do we evidence that to allow decision makers in our respective countries to be able to adopt, fund, and actually transform how we deliver care, which again requires some investment in enabling infrastructure and technical architecture to do so. So the approach we're taking, as Barbara's already outlined, is around about challenges, but then it's also about how do we describe the pathway and potentially use machine learning and other approaches to be able to first case find, risk stratify, diagnose, and then treat, and recognising there's an opportunity with the emerging role of data as a foundational requirement. So how do we take the quill out of the hand of the professor of whatever to be able to generate structured healthcare data that supports the delivery of care operational level, as well as allowing us to innovate and be able to adopt new technologies to do that, recognising that increasingly the model has to be shifted into the community, and a lot of investment from Scottish Government and the Chief Scientist Office is really around about that activity. Is how do we get structured data insight to be able to support community care rather than patients coming into hospital for their care delivery, either electively as an outpatient or coming in to an emergency department or immediate assessment unit. And blockers to adoption, I think, is a good place to start as we talk about what we've done to be able to create infrastructure, and that's an understanding of the capabilities around about leadership and how we invest in the individuals that are able to be systems leader and understand that context of how do we develop people to engage in that collaborative process of pathway redesign, transformation and adoption of new digital health technologies. How do we coordinate that? And again, that's about understanding what the needs are, decision-making process that happens in terms of funding and procurement that Barbara's already outlined, and align that so that actually when we're challenging a company, industry partner, or academic to produce a solution, they understand the target architecture and pathway for that clinical care moment, be it in an outpatient community setting or into hospital, and understanding that journey. And that's really that kind of classic visualization of the swimmer's diagram of the patient journey, the data journey, and the clinician journey, recognizing there's multiple touch points that we need to again be able to describe. How do we gather evidence to support decision making around about adoption, and how do we create such persuasive evidence that it means that you can't not progress to do this? And ultimately for us, from an academic perspective and from a health economic perspective, that is being able to demonstrate both clinical effectiveness, cost effectiveness, acceptability, and the performance of that particular device. And it's about consistent adoption of pathways, and think about where the confluence is. So from a simplistic level as an emergency physician, somebody with undifferentiated breathlessness might be a viral etiology, might be bacterial, so infective, might be heart failure, might be COPD, might be other, but ultimately there's a suite of diagnostic interventions need to happen which are predominantly around about the demographic symptoms of that individual, potentially a specialist test, be it spirometry or an echo, which I'm going to touch on later, but actually it's the same. When you take assisted view, there's a pathway that those patients require that has a number of touch points, and how do we create consistency around about that, recognising this confluence. And that's finally the piece around about scalability, is if we're going to do this, it needs to be scalable. So anything we create for heart failure and COPD can be applied to other long-term conditions, and actually can recognise that people have comorbidities. So therefore, that question around about saying, let's, for instance, heart failure and COPD, 20% of the population in Glasgow have both. So therefore, we can't create discrete solutions for one, and we need to be able to demonstrate again to purchasers, the people that are making decisions around about paying, that for adoption, that we're providing a solution that actually responds to patient needs. And that really speaks to the money aspect, is there's very little money in the public sector. So how do we capitalise on industry partnerships? And we've been relatively successful in doing that in Scotland. And that speaks again to that collaboration piece around how do we describe challenges, that great idea, and how do we be able to marry those two up, which again is around about capacity and capability building in individuals, and then demonstrating through exemplar pieces of work how this can impact and then bring it onto scale. So the infrastructure investment we put in place is the innovation hubs, which is broadly around about bringing the NHS, industry and academia together in that catalyst format to be able to bring ideas together and represent that triple helix. We put together fellowship opportunities, giving people time out of their clinical environment across healthcare professionals, so not just medics and doctors, but nurses, physiotherapists, and pushing into social care. And as Barbara's described, a set of catalyst programs that really are defining our challenges and inviting individuals to work within these hubs to be able to progress from feasibility study through to adoption, recognising investment is critical for this. And we're really challenging our higher education institutes, universities, around about spin outs and how do we support that. And that broadly, that infrastructure is responding to these needs, which is around about how do we engage and scope in a problem, initiate and co-design, be able to develop a feasibility study, accessing to data and patients and clinicians. And that's what we find is most valuable to most industry partners. It's not necessarily money. It's actually about access to the system and an understanding of how they develop a product that people want and that ultimately responds to our needs and improves patient outcomes. How do we validate that? So supporting companies getting their CE mark, going through regulatory approval, which obviously becomes increasingly complex as you move from med tech into AI. And then that market validation. If we can demonstrate it works, recognizing that Scotland or Glasgow or whichever board is not a single customer, and that should be where that journey stops for that company, but it's how do you access international markets, because ultimately that reduces the cost for us as payers if that solution responds to our needs. And then increasingly post-market surveillance, and that key requirement from CE mark and post-market surveillance is to be able to demonstrate that the product solution is still performant. And because there's no money, it's really about squeezing value out of that triple helix collaboration, and that requires us to have a shared understanding. And Anna Dominiczek, who's the chief scientist and my boss, is very keen on the idea of porosity, which is really being able to say, whether it be you be a clinical academic, an industry partner, or somebody working in the NHS, how do we get a shared understanding and provide a core to be able to do that? And that's where the innovation hubs come in as both a place-based opportunity as well as some enabling infrastructure around about access to data, expertise around about clinical trial design, and ultimately how do we evidence your product to be able to take that forward. I'm going to touch very briefly on a health data exchange. This is one of our enabling infrastructures. That was part of the wide brief that Nessa gave me, and that's around about how do we transact data. And that's been a key enabler for us to be able to work with industry partners to say you don't have to worry about the integration into clinical systems. That's sorted. Here's a set of open APIs to allow us to do this. But what we are going to therefore allow you and enable you to do is be able to transact data from your app, from your wearable, from your device into that clinical care system, so we can actually start to, again, evidence the potential for your product to deliver care within a clinical setting. And that's one of these key abilities, and it allows us to be able to streamline the engagement with industry partners to provide those solutions. Because if we're constantly just doing things in sandboxes and simulation environments, we can't actually be able to describe that last piece. I'm going to give you 4 very quick examples about that. The first is, again, the Office of Life Science priority around about drug test reduction, and this is a company called Pneumawave, which is a Scottish-based small to medium enterprise that developed a device that really detects and responds to a patient with opioid-induced respiratory depression, and now scaling out to other solutions such as pediatric apnea. Using that health data exchange, we're able to demonstrate the performance of that device in a number of settings. Part of our support for that through the innovation hubs is to be able to do that, for instance, in the emergency department and gain data for patients that come in with toxicology presentations, and equally those that through the process of procedural sedation, because they've got a dislocated shoulder, that we give medication that puts them at risk of periods of apnea. And that's been really critical for them to develop the machine learning algorithms and get high quality data in clinical environments that then they can push through into developing their service model. And these guys are now at Series A funding and going into the US and Australian markets. The second example is very close to my heart, is around about Dynamic, which is COPD, and that's a digital service. Again, we had to start with structured data to support clinical care, and they're now building out into AI, and we've now got the first AI implementation of a multidisciplinary team system in the world. But what we did was essentially created a clinical system that allowed patients to report how they're feeling, to give us data through their wearables, for those with high risk of type 2 respiratory failure, to get the data from their non-invasive ventilation devices at home, and then to be able to aggregate that with electronic healthcare data to support clinical care in the community, be able to demonstrate reduction in bed days to be able to do that. And then be able to, again, develop that solution into how do we care for people with COPD, obstructive sleep apnea and heart failure, in a very similar model of how do we ultimately engage patients in a clinical system that demonstrates value to them, evidence that, and now we're doing very rapid scale up into this winter to be able to support care of patients within COPD, recognising it's the second most common reason for admission into hospital. Next example is around about lung cancer. I'm about to go live with a lung cancer detection tool in Glasgow. Next week is a multi-sector randomised cluster trial, again gathering evidence. 40% of the patients within Glasgow sadly present with stage 4 cancer, lung cancer. So it's really about how do we reduce the time from request from chest X-ray, so using AI to support flagging those individuals that potentially got urgent suspected cancer on their chest X-ray. This is already a CE-mark device, but what we're doing is creating evidence for national adoption of this product or a similar product into the healthcare system, which is really around about demonstrating, again, clinical effectiveness, cost effectiveness, performance of the device critically, as well as acceptability to both the radiologists, the radiographers, and patients as well. And generating that evidence is really critical because as we want to move towards proactive screening models, that as we know that mortality increases by 10% every 6 months, a patient doesn't have a diagnosis made. And heart failure is another good example of how we're doing that at the diagnostic phase. How do we identify case-find individuals in the community at risk, use established biomarker technology from the last 10, 15 years, BNP, to support a vetting process to bring high priority patients in for our screening tests. And what we did and funded through AstraZeneca and Roche was to be able to validate an AI solution to support the screening of those individuals with echo. So using portable echo to be able to take the images, put them up into the cloud and generate a report that supports both the diagnostic and screening process for those individuals. And then moving on to be able to demonstrate if you put that same AI solution for echo interpretation into the diagnostic pathway, it can be able to produce efficiencies for sonographers as they're really challenged around about availability. So again, a workforce challenge around about how do we streamline the diagnostic process, recognising that we've got significant limitations in the pathway and how do we respond to them. And the final example around this is around drones, and we've been funded by UK government to look at drone networks and how does that support logistics with some critical examples, not necessarily around cardiac arrest and supporting Scottish Ambulance Service, and that's one of the kind of critical aspects. One of the key exemplars is around about how do we supply blood to individuals with major hemorrhage in hospitals that don't have a huge amount of blood bank storage. And the second example is how do we provide with equity chemotherapy options to individuals in remote and rural settings. And that's been one of the kind of key pushes of this particular work in Scotland, and I presume there's interest in this in the rest of Europe, is be able to say, actually, how do we deliver drugs to individuals in the Highlands and Islands without asking them to go on long car journeys or get on ferries to come across to get chemotherapy drugs to go back onto a fairly nauseating therapy that actually reduces the compliance with therapy. I mean, and using drones and new technology and an infrastructure justification to be able to do that. So what we believe in Scotland is there's absolutely an opportunity around about unlocking digitally enabled care through description of how do we provide evidence to decision makers to support adoption, and data is a key element of that. And what I'm going to do is just very quickly describe that that solution very much looks like not just adoption into the NHS, but how do we be evidence to be able to support companies going out to external markets, but equally working with European partners to come to Scotland to work with innovation hubs to develop their solutions to demonstrate generalisability. And that's really about realising value into the NHS. So thank you very much. I know that we've obviously got an adoption process within Scotland to do that. And again, it's very much a collaborative process and very happy to take any questions. Thank you very much.
We've got loads of people in the chat who are from various countries and regions around Europe and wider. What are the opportunities for them to collaborate with you?
So I think the most obvious thing, and it's obviously in the news in the UK this morning, is that we're now back into Horizon, which is a really significant thing. So that's obviously one of the opportunities to get money. So I think we're all delighted about that in the UK, that uncertainty has been removed. I think, as we've talked about already, it's that collaboration thing of how do we broaden that, and EHTEL is a really good example of how do we bring people together that understand the opportunities, that can be able to engage with industry and academia to do that. Part of my role, I suppose, within the Chief Scientist Office is how do we break down those existing silos of clinical academics working with their established collaborations and the drivers that they currently have around about funding and papers that doesn't actually speak to translation and transformation of clinical care. And that's one of the kind of key challenges I think we all have, is how do we take what's great within higher education institutes and really provide that provocation to say, yeah, do this, but then how do we demonstrate translational transformative benefits and be able to pull that through. And I think this EHTEL again is one of those opportunities, but how do we broaden that challenge to industry and academia? And actually big industry like AstraZeneca, other big pharma are very good at pulling together those international collaborations. Opera, the heart failure work, is now spread across multiple jurisdictions in Europe, and the same with COPD, recognising that industry often has to have those drivers around about scale up. And certainly within Scotland, we're really motivated to support that clinical and market validation that allows those companies to take those solutions. And we're delighted that, for instance, the COPD solution, which again is a SME based in Edinburgh, is now both in the UK, so in the rest of, not just in Scotland, but also into Denmark as well. So that's a really good example of how we develop a solution, but how do we demonstrate generalizability? And that's obviously bi-directional. How does colleagues on this call and otherwise recognise that needs to be able to provide market validation out with your own country is a critical step for those companies in terms of growth.
Thanks so much. Barbara, on your side, in CivTech, are you working with international partners, other European partners?
Yes, so on the company's side, we do, and this addresses one of the questions in the chat as well, we do actually actively encourage applications from, well, anywhere in the world, but we have been actively pursuing campaigns in Europe, and obviously being the Scottish Government project, we seek applications from, we do actually seek applications from England, Wales, Northern Ireland as well. We've also done some tentative work with a public sector agency in Ireland to look at the feasibility of being able to do effectively run challenges in parallel, because what we've identified is that would provide a real opportunity to do good market signalling to companies that are interested in responding. So where we've got a shared problem, we use a PCP approach, but effectively running parallel open challenges in a way which opens up wider market opportunities to respondents. We've not managed to take that work forward into practice yet, but it is actually something that we're continuing to be interested. We continue to be interested in pursuing.
One of Matteo Melidio's questions is about the need for data quality and data availability, and particularly in the way it can help unblock adoption and innovation. That may be a question for you, David. Maybe Barbara has got some thoughts on that as well.
Yeah, I think there's probably three elements. So the first is kind of systematic level. We've established a national digital platform to be able to put data into in a kind of cloud-based resource that's very structured against fire and SNOMED. So using those kind of architectural standards to be able to do that. I think equally we've had to work phenomenally hard across a lot of these digital systems, especially when we're moving into the kind of AI piece and being able to train AI against, I suppose, a ground truth that's actually a truth. We spend quite a lot of time in the existential question of what is actually a truth. Do we use an electronic health record that says somebody's got a diagnosis of COPD? But when we look into that, there's probably about a 10% error rate in that. So we've had to work often quite hard with industry partners, and lung cancer is a really great example of what is the ground truth? Is it at biopsy level? Is it at CT level? Is it the chest X-ray that's got features on urgent suspected cancer? So I think the bottom line is around how do we create the digital architecture and substrate that allows us to innovate on top of? And that's actually got to be a core requirement for healthcare systems delivery that allows us then to innovate on top of. And we shouldn't have to be innovating on how do we collect data in a structured manner, because otherwise, other industries have sorted that, but otherwise you're just going to spend an awful lot of time recreating systems that actually should already be digitized. And that's really a question for governments, is how do we push that forward?
Barbara, not to push you, you may wish that we go on to maybe one more question.
Oh, I'd just quickly say that in the wider context here, this is also about the issue of standards. So looking at the implementation of standards alongside the infrastructure so that people are doing things to standardized quality. But also when it comes to the kind of AI side of things, we've done some good work at a national level on the on an AI strategy, which looks at these issues of openness and transparency as well. So where you're talking about the fundamentals of the design of some of these technologies, there's principles that can be applied that do help. So yeah, maybe less specific to health data, but these are all parts of a wider conversations we're having around these areas.
Thank you. Thanks very much, everyone, for your engagement and questions. I'm going to